We're going to pick up this video here with the steps in preparing a production report for process costing. And this is the report that's really going to capture the equivalent units and the travel of costs through the various processes. And there are 5 steps in this process, and we will begin with steps 1 and 2 here. Now let me move myself here. We have nothing in our beginning work in process. We have 36,000 started, we have 30,000 completed, and our ending inventory has 6 units that are not complete. So the slide asks us to explain why we are measuring the output in equivalent units. Well, remember that we are measuring automatically the output as the units literally go out of this process and into the next. If that is our only measure, is the physical, as it physically travels out, we are missing the costs that are associated with the products sitting in this phase of the inventory, and that will misrepresent the costs in our work in process inventory if we don't do something about that. And I can't advance this slide. Okay, so we got to do a little bit of math here. And so the first thing we need to determine is how many units did we start and finish? And the calculation for that is units completed minus what was in our beginning work in process inventory. Well, we didn't have anything in our beginning work in process inventory, so that's pretty simple. We finished 30, and so those are the units that we started and finished. Now, how many units did we start? And the answer to that is we take our ending work in process inventory and we add that to the units started and completed, so that we know that we started a total of 36,000 units during this period. And we're gonna, let me just move this here. So we've got this physical flow report that tells us how many units we need to account for and that we in fact accounted for those. But notice at this point we're not yet prorating our work in process. We're looking at these as whole units as part of work in process, so we got to fix that. And now let me move this. Not all processes will involve the same amount of work. So we need to determine in this particular process what percentage of the process has been applied, or the processes, has been applied to those items up through this phase. And so we have decided that the work in this phase is basically 25% complete. And if we take the ending work in process inventory and multiply that by 0.25, that gets us an equivalent number of units in our work in process inventory of 1,500 units. Therefore, our total equivalent units that we're going to be dealing with for this period is 31,500. We've got the units that we finished plus the units in process, and there we go. So now let's figure out what we're going to do in terms of costs now that we know how many equivalent units that we've got to deal with. So we've got total costs of $787,500 for this period, and we are applying them on a per test basis. So now we can start assigning costs on a per test basis. Nowhere for me to go. All right, so we know we've got $787,500 for costs. We know that we have equivalent units of 31,500, and that gets us $25 per test or unit. And so then we prepare this little reconciliation report to make sure that we've in fact accounted for all of the costs. So we've got our tests completed at $25 a unit, and that was 30,000, so that gets us to 750,000. Then we have our ending work in process at 25 a unit times the 1,500 units, and that's 37,500, and lo and behold, that works us back to the total costs. So we know that we have, okay, sorry about brief interruption. All right, so what I'm showing you here is the production report based on the calculations that we just did. And if it were all on one page, you wouldn't really be able to see it very well because it would be in about 8-point font. So what you see on this slide would be the top half, and then in a second I will jump over to the bottom half. But this information then gets set out in our production report, and so I'll go ahead and jump to the second part, and you will see, so we've got unit calculations here, and then we have cost calculations on the bottom half. Now, in the example that we just did, we had no beginning work in process inventory. But what happens when we do? There's a couple of approaches we can take in terms of dealing with the flow of costs with beginning work in process inventory. We can either look at it based on a FIFO method or a weighted average. So we'll first take a look at FIFO. So when we use FIFO, we are going to ignore units in beginning work in process because the costs associated with those were assigned before they left the prior process in the prior period. We're also going to assume that anything that was in our beginning work in process inventory were the items that we at the beginning of this period started working on first and moved first out of our process into the next department. And so we're going to use the Binastar's antihistamine product for this example. And I believe it or not, I have to look around my camera to even read this slide. So we've got, I move this here, the production report from May. And we start May 1 with 15,000 units that are 70% complete. We have 90,000 during the period that we completed and transferred out. And then our ending process on May 31st, those are 40% complete, and those are 30,000 of those. So just like with our first example, we start off with units started and completed. So we finished 90,000 units. Of those 90,000 units, 15,000 of those were already in our beginning inventory at the beginning of the period. So if we subtract those, we get 75,000 units that we both started and finished during that period. So then we need to figure out, well, what did we start? We started and completed 75,000 units, and we had 30,000 units in our ending inventory. So we started 105,000 units during that period. Okay, so here's where we start to allocate costs. We have 30,000 of our ending work in process inventory that got 100% of its direct materials, but only 40% of the conversion costs. So we need to make that allocation. And then we've got the conversion costs associated with the beginning inventory. And you know, I'm sure you're probably saying, wait, I thought you said we could ignore that. And so the answer is that this $4,500 that we're applying to the beginning work in process inventory is what we then applied to it to get those beginning units through the process and out. Because remember, we're assuming that those 15,000 units that we started our period with are the first ones that we then finished and moved along down the pipeline. And looking at the costs that were applied here. We have total costs of $23,475, and we just now need to convert this to a per unit, and I keep moving myself around here, cost. So we have 105,000 that were our unit material costs, and then we have 105,000 units, I should say, that we're applying the materials cost to, and then we have 91,500 units that we're applying conversion costs to. So we then sort of break those out separately, and we've got 18 cents a unit in materials, 5 cents a unit in conversion costs, and that gets us to 23 cents per ounce, or unit in this case. Okay, so then we take that those equivalent unit costs that we just calculated, and we apply the cost to complete the beginning work in process inventory at 5 cents times 4,500 for direct materials, and then started and completed, so they get the whole 23 cents per unit times the 75 units that we started and finished. And so this gets us, for the cost of goods transferred out, 19,500. Then we look at our ending work in process inventory, and we have the 5 cents and the 18 cents respectively on those two, and that gets us to 6,000. This brings us to 25,500. So remember, this is cost of goods transferred out, because you're like, wait a minute, I thought we were calculating it was like 23,000 and change, and you would be correct. So the 23,475 is costs that we incurred in May, and the additional $2,025 to get us to the 25,500 for our inventory valuation has to include the beginning inventory valuation, which of which those costs had occurred in a prior period. So that's how we get to 25,500. We prepare our handy dandy little report here, this being the top half, and so this might set it out a little bit more clearly for you than looking at it kind of on a slide-by-slide basis. So we've calculated our equivalent units here. We know the total of what we have to account for, and then the split between direct materials and conversion costs, and then we start applying cost calculations to those. And this brings us, once we add our prior period stuff to it, down to total cost to account for 25,500. And I'm going to stop here and go on to the next slide for weighted average.